lot we don't understand, but here's what we do need to understand. There's way more going on than we see or understand. That's what we need to understand. So do not let this secular world beat you into unbelief about the reality of the unseen realm. There are forces more powerful than you can imagine all around you, and when the church starts praying, they start moving. You're seeing this right here. Now, in fact, I love this. I'm a guy, I love a good P&L. Just give it to me clean. Let me see what's for me. Let me see what's against me. I want 2 columns. I want it to be clean, okay? Here's the Acts 12 P&L for Peter. What's for him, what's against him. All right, I love this so much. I got a chart for you. I love charts. Here's what was against him. King Herod was against him. The Jewish people were against him. Prison bars were against him. 4 squads of soldiers against him. Chains against him. Sentries against him. But watch this. Before I show you what was for him ended up being greater than what was against him. And there was only one thing for him. Here's what was for him. What was for him was a praying church. He had a praying church. And what was on the right side of the column was a lot more powerful in the end than everything on the left side of the column. Why? Because when the church starts to pray, things start to move and things start to change on earth. This is just what you see right here, all right? You might be in this spot right now where you go, man, everything's against me on the chart. A medical diagnosis, a prodigal child, depression, anxiety, age, sin, family, people who hate you, all these things. But watch this, there's one thing that's for you, and if you have this one thing that's for you, it can be greater than everything against you. It's this one verse in Acts 12. And then earnest prayer for him or for her was made to God by the church. And that changes everything. Changes everything. Okay, now, let me transition and end it. This sermon only has 2 points. Here's the final point. I'm going to start landing it here. Here's the final point. There is supernatural influence in a praying church. There is supernatural influence in a praying church. Did you notice how the verse said, watch real carefully. The verse said, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. It's plural. It's plural. Can I say something to you? It is good to pray alone. Wonderful to pray alone. When you become a man or a woman of prayer, your whole life starts to change. God is no longer a concept. He's a person. In fact, what I've learned in my personal life, this is a different sermon, is that in private prayer, that's how the word becomes flesh for me. I can pray things into my heart that weren't there. If I get alone with God and turn them into a prayer, all of a sudden I start to see, want, think, and feel things that I did not want before. That's what happens in prayer. But watch this. Good to pray alone. Good to pray alone. Better to pray together. Better to pray together. This is a little macabre, like a little rough. That was a big word. I didn't use that in any other service. Distracting. This is a little like rough. But I just got to notice this. The passage starts, James is arrested and he gets martyred. There is no mention of the church coming together to pray. I'm sure his friends and his family were praying for him individually, but the church didn't come together to pray. They didn't pray for James together. James dies. Peter gets arrested. The church comes together and he prays, and Peter's delivered. It's good to pray alone. Better to pray together. The Bible tells us, Jesus tells us exactly why this is. Here's the spiritual dynamic. Jesus said this. He said, again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you, I just need 2, he's going. Imagine if 2 of you on earth agree, I'm going to come back to this, about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. There's power in agreement in prayer. The word that gets translated agree in English, it's the Greek word symphoneo. Church, this is not a trick question. I'm not juking you here. What English word do we have that you think came from the Greek word symphoneo? What do you think it is? 1, 2, 3, symphony. Symphony. What is a symphony? It's a whole bunch of different instruments who come together in a unified harmony, and they create something more powerful together than any of them can reproduce alone. There's power in agreement and prayer. In fact, I didn't put this in my notes, but it is in my heart. In the Old Testament, it says that when the blessing of God falls on the people of God, you remember what it says? 1 can put to flight 1,000, 2 can put to flight 10,000. You would think it would say one would put 1,000 to flight and two would put 2,000 to flight, but that's not what it says. One puts 1,000 to flight, two, 10,000. There is exponential spiritual power when the church begins to pray together. Exponential spiritual power. Now, here's how I'm going to finish this message, and then we're going to have a chance for you to receive prayer in the service. And here's how I do that. When I finish the sermon, what I do is I pray through each point of the sermon, asking God, what do you want for people? Here's what's going to happen in a second. I'm going to give you a chance to pray. Some of you are going to take a step you've never taken before in your life to receive prayer with a church that earnestly prays. And because you do something you've never done before, God is going to work in a way he's never worked before. But let me show you this. There's power in a church that prays together. Now, what I'm going to do right here is I'm taking a bit of a risk as a preacher. I'm going to walk through a little segment of church history. It's a little deep cutty, okay? But I just, at most churches, I wouldn't do this, but I really believe Lakepoint Church is not most churches, and y'all can handle this, okay? Thank you. Here we go. So there's power in a church that prays together, okay? On the suggestion of a prayer mentor of mine, long-distance prayer mentor, a pastor named John Tyson, I started reading about the Moravians in the last few months. I'm very curious at all of our campuses, just curious, there's no shame if you haven't. Who's ever heard of the Moravians before? Okay? The front rowers, of course. That's great. Makes sense. Moravians. They were probably in the last service. Okay. Here's who the Moravians were. They were started by a young guy in his 20s when he began it, a guy named Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Baby name available. We're trying to give you those weekly now. Ludwig von Zinzendorf. And he was a German noble, but he was exposed. He had a godly grandmother, and so she would bring in all these white hot first love Christian missionaries from all over the world, and they would bless them in their home. So he grew up around all this, and the Spirit of God and the purposes of God just attached themselves to him, and he developed the heart of God. So later, he inherited enough resources to purchase enough land that he started this little village called Herrnhut. And at Herrnhut, he started this thing. It was called the Order of the Mustard Seed. It was a secret society of Christians. And what they did is it was a bunch of dudes in their 20s, and they got together to pray and fast and petition heaven for the purposes of God. This little thing turned into a 24-hour, 7-day per week prayer meeting that lasted more than 100 years without breaking. A 24-hour per day, 7-day a week, 100-year-long prayer meeting. Some Bible church historians say the Moravians ended up being the most generative group in the history of Christianity for their size. Let me give you some examples of this. Over the next few years, 1 out of every 10 of the Moravians felt called of God, left everything, and gave their lives for Christ on the foreign mission field. 1 out of every 10. William Carey, who some of you have heard of before, we now know William Carey as the father of the modern missions movement. There are still churches in India. He went to India. There are still churches in India that exist today because of the Spirit-filled church planting movement started by William Carey. It was a Moravian pamphlet. William Carey was 22 years old. He reads this Moravian pamphlet about their missionaries all over the world. He reads it, walks into a Baptist society, throws the pamphlet down on the desk, points at the society and says, "Why can't we reach the heathens like the Moravians?" And he ends up going, inspired by that Moravian pamphlet, to India. John Wesley, who was the founder of the Wesleyan and Methodist streams of the churches, John Wesley grew up in a nominally Christian family, and then he was on a boat from Great Britain to America. He's on this boat, huge storm. Everybody on the boat thinks they're going to die. John Wesley's wigging out. He's freaking out. But he looks around. Everybody on the boat was a Moravian except him. He looks around at all them, and he notices they have perfect peace of soul. They're all like, "We're hugging Jesus today. This is awesome." He notices they have peace of soul, and he goes, they have something I don't have. He falls under conviction. He gets home, walks by a prayer meeting, goes into the prayer meeting, and he goes, he said that his, quote, his heart was strangely warmed. He was saved. He experienced a fullness of the Spirit he'd never felt before. And then he ends up being the one who leads the first great awakening at that time over in Great Britain. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people come to Christ under the preaching of John Wesley. It started on a boat around a bunch of Moravians. George Whitefield, who led the first great awakening in America. Hundreds of thousands of people in our nation come to Christ under George Whitefield. George Whitefield, when he's young, stumbles into a Moravian prayer meeting. There was 30 to 60 people there. They're praying at 2 or 3 in the morning. They said that the Spirit of God came down. Everybody in the room just fell prostrate on the floor. By the way, I have been in a room as that happened before. It just the presence and weight of the glory of God came down. They start crying out, "Surely you are the Lord." George Whitefield, again, he experiences a fullness of the Spirit he's never experienced before. From that day on, every time George Whitefield preaches, the power of God just bowls over everybody in attendance. This is one of my favorite George Whitefield stories, not in my notes, but it is in my heart. This was around the time that the printing press was invented. So these dudes came to George Whitefield and they were like, "Hey, can we print your sermons?" And his response was, "You can print the words, but nobody can print the lightning and the thunder." He's like, he just noticed there was something in his life. That all started at a Moravian prayer meeting. There was an island about this time. Some of you have heard of this island, St. John's Island, around this same time. It was a slave island. The only way anybody would be allowed on the island was if they were a slave. 2 young men, one dude was 26 years old, heard that they had never heard the gospel before. These 2 young men are willing to sell themselves into slavery so that they can take the gospel to the lost people of St. John's Island. Some of you have heard this story before. It's a story where as they're sailing away in their boat, as they're just on the horizon, they turn around, look back at their friends, family, and parents on the shore, raise their hands in the air and scream, "May the Lamb who was slain receive the reward of his suffering." They go to St. John's Island, and it's said about them that when they came, there was no light, and when they left, there was no darkness. They were Moravians. These were 2 young dudes. They were Moravian missionaries. William Wilberforce, who you guys may remember from your high school history class. William Wilberforce, elected to British Parliament when he's 22 years old. He's the one who started advocating for the abolition of the slave trade in Great Britain. He does that. He's a Bible-believing, evangelical, conservative Christian. He starts doing that. All the other people in British Parliament are like, "Bro, we can't free the slave. You can't just go walk around freeing slaves. Nobody knows what's going to happen if you just free a bunch of slaves." He points to what happened on St. John's Island through the ministry of the Moravian missionaries as a case study. And he goes, "Yes, we do. Look at all the amazing things that happened over there when they were saved and freed." And after he does that, eventually, he is the reason the slave trade was originally abolished in Great Britain. All of this goes back. Listen, if the math isn't mathing in your head, let me recap some things. So the modern missions movement started. John Wesley and George Whitefield were saved and experienced the fullness of the Spirit. The first great awakening where the gospel sweeps across 2 continents happened. Global mission was catalyzed. 100-year prayer meeting happened. The abolition of the slave trade happened in Great Britain. Why? Because 300 people started praying together. There is power. There is power in a church that prays. So we've got time. We blocked off time in this service. We're just